This short lecture will provide some more basics in regards to our practice in working with diverse populations. And I call this a framework for practice, in that there are just some general principles here that we should keep in mind as we approach our work with diverse populations. Minority populations that we're going to come in contact with have experienced oppression. In large part, that oppression has been created by the institutions in our lives and in our society. These institutions such as religion, the institution of education, the legal system, the media, even the family in some cases can be considered institutions which support the status quo and thus underlie oppression of minority populations in many respects. Now, historically, our social work profession has been a champion for advocacy for the dispossessed and the oppressed. The services that we provide need to be culturally competent and also culturally sensitive. We should not, as the NASW code says, practice, condone, facilitate, or collaborate with any form of discrimination on the basis of race, ethnicity, national origin, color, sex, sexual orientation, age, marital status, political belief, religion, or mental or physical disability. The oppression that exists in our society comes in such forms as racism and ethnocentrism, sexism, classism, ableism, heterosexism, ageism, xenophobia, religious bigotry. All of these isms are social situations that exist in our clients' life, which really makes living very toxic for them. We'll be looking at many of these isms and these forms of oppression during the course of the semester. The way social workers approach a practice is that we intervene with individuals at the point that they interface with their social environment, his or her social environment. And so we work with the individual, but we also work with the various levels of that person's environment as well. So while we may focus upon helping our clients understand and cope with their environment, good practice and also our ethics require that we also look at advocating for social change so that their opportunities improve and the quality of their life is better. We combine our ecological model with the diversity framework in this class in particular, and we approach our studies from the idea of using the strengths perspective and the empowerment perspectives in working with clients. Social workers oftentimes approach this field with the intention of working with individuals and helping persons to cope better and to get along better in their lives and to generally to have a better quality to their life. This means that a lot of times that we focus, as we approach our studies, we focus upon learning how to interact and work with individuals and various different techniques we can use to help lift them from the situations that troubled them or that brought them to us. But we have to also keep in mind that we have a larger responsibility as well, and that is to look at their problems not only from a personal standpoint, but from a macro perspective as well. When you take a policy course, for instance, you'll find that legislators are oftentimes very happy to find social work students raising questions about policy because they're aware of the fact that social workers often go into practice looking to work with individuals in a treatment perspective rather than looking at a social change perspective and in engaging in important social work on the policy level. And so we need to remember to keep both a micro and a macro level focus in mind as we work with our clients. Ask ourselves this question: does our practice help by advocating for the client's cause and by pushing society to meet the needs of the client? This is as the slide says, this is a dilemma within our field. Do we utilize social control, or do we, which really in a sense is a little of what we do when we work with the individual to adjust to an oppressive society? Or do we focus upon social change as our framework for intervention? And can we do both? That's something for conversation as the semester goes along, I suspect. Our ecological framework for practice, as we look at it, especially in this diversity class, employs 5 different domains or levels that are interconnected. And if you think of the circle with the individual in the center and then concentric rings outside, you start at the bottom of this is the individual, the family, the cultural, the environmental and structural, and the historical. The historical kind of spans across all of those concentric domains or levels in the client's life. It helps us to understand that the client's experience is not only based in the here and now, but is also based in part upon what has come before. So we assess the condition of the client in relation to each of these levels and keep an evolutionary view of human beings in mind that considers the fact that adaptations are necessary as we go through time. So our work with clients to adjust and to find a way to interact successfully with society is very important in that respect. But each element of this ecosystem shapes the other. The individual is not a victim of the family or cultural pressures or by the environmental constraints placed upon them, nor of his or her group's history. The individual also can impact those different levels as well and interacts with them in a mutual exchange. So one of the things that we will do is help our clients to learn to interact effectively with each of those levels in their ecological framework. But there are processes that create stresses and problems in living for individuals. For instance, life transitions is one of the things that's mentioned here. These transitions require the individual to restructure his or her life space in order to accommodate these transitions. And particularly if the change is very sudden, unexpected, the stress can be higher. Gradual change allows more time for an adjustment. Those predictable kinds of transitions that we go through as we go through life, for instance, while they create stress, it's stress of a different kind than, say, experiencing the death of a close family member or a divorce or those kinds of things, which come sometimes unexpectedly and suddenly. Likewise, though, the client is existing in that environment, those 5 levels of existence, and client's environment can either provide support through those life transitions or it can interfere with those life transitions and be a source of stress rather than support. Oppressed groups, marginalized individuals often find that their opportunity is closed or limited by the institutions in their environment. And this can even include the institutions that are supposed to be helping the person, such as the individual's religion or the educational system or the mental health system or social services system. As we go through the semester, we'll be talking about some of that. The institutions that are there that support the majority through many of those institutions, the persons with privilege, oftentimes those without privilege have a very different experience in interacting with those institutions. So our intervention on the individual level with the client is to focus on addressing the client's sense of powerlessness in dealing with these issues through helping the client see himself or herself as competent and worthwhile. Then to work to facilitate a shift in their thinking so that the client doesn't see himself or herself as being trapped in a subordinate role, working to counter stereotypes and myths that arise from the client's marginal status, because those stereotypes sometimes can become internalized, and that's when they become particularly crippling, when the oppressed person begins to believe the stereotypes that the larger society places upon them and begins to, in a sense, fulfill those expectations. So we want to help the client to avoid internalizing myths and acting out the stereotypes, to overcome self-perceptions of being powerlessness and victimized, and to learn new strategies to avoid contributing to their own victimization. This is what is referred to as stigma management, if you want to look that up a little bit. It's an interesting concept if you're not familiar with it, and it's worth some study. It's important to keep in mind that the worker must keep the practice also focused on policy change and community change by addressing environmental pressures, like we identify here: discrimination, violence, prejudice, mistreatment, those types of things, as well as to mobilize the political and social institutions around the client to address private troubles such as this as the public issues that they are. Instead of blaming the client for their plight, to accept the responsibility, the institutions accepting the responsibility to alter the conditions that create these negative forces in the client's life. An example: if you have a client who comes to you and talks about an instance, let's say a female client comes to you and talks about gender discrimination, sexual harassment in the workplace. Now, as a social worker, as an individual treatment specialist interacting with that client, one of the things you want to do is to help the client develop assertiveness skills and to develop a strategy for confronting that oppression in the work site so that it stops. But your work doesn't stop there. Your work really also needs to look at the larger issues about sexual harassment and gender discrimination and begin to work with the institutions that oversee that client's place of employment to begin to alter that on a larger level as well. It isn't only the client's responsibility. We help the client to deal with these issues, but it's also our responsibility to address the larger issues that support the oppression the clients experience. Most of us in the profession, and this is not true for all of you who are listening to this and who are in this class, but for myself and for many of other persons in the class, our default perspective is white middle class heterosexual standards, and that's a part of, again, those American values that Phyllis Day talked about in the lecture on values. It's just something that's there, that's in us, and even those of us who aren't white middle class and heterosexual may still look at ourselves through those same standards and judge ourselves with those standards. See those standards as preferable because that's sort of the default thing. It's often said that white people think that they don't have a race because they're white, and race isn't an issue for white people. It's that kind of idea that, well, this is the way things start, and anything different from that is where there are problems. So this is the way we're raised, and we have to make a conscious effort to recognize that is the standard, to recognize the privilege that's associated with that, and begin to find ways to not only to recognize that, but also to begin to find ways to work against the oppression that results from those standards. We look at clients in the context of their own culture in order to work with individuals effectively, instead of using this standard to measure people against that is that overarching kind of societal standard. Keeping in mind also that within each group, there are variations that perhaps are greater than the variations from one group to the next. So this means that we have to not only see persons as individuals, as a member of a culture or a minority group, but also understand that each person is an individual within their group and not buy into any stereotypes that might be back there about those individuals. I have to apologize, by the way, for some of the background noises. You're going to hear Big Ben ringing in the background, which sometimes can be very distracting to me when I'm trying to focus on my, what I'm trying to bring across. Also, not far from my home is a freight line, and so occasionally you're going to hear train whistles in the background, and you might even hear my husky barking for my attention. So any of those things that come up, just kind of ignore them as I try to do myself. So finally, I just want, again, to mention about traditional values in America that focus on things such as individualism, private ownership and property, and minimal government intervention. That's sort of the libertarian view of, if you're going to think about politics. The Republicans are often associated with this, but really this is kind of more of a libertarian stance about the fact that government should be minimally involved. Individuals should have their own area and should be able to live their own lives and should take care of themselves. These are very traditional values. Again, many of them arising from those 9 values that Phyllis Day presented to us. But when you're a member of a minority population, these traditional values and others present very, very great difficulty in day-to-day living. The value base that instead of these individualism and private ownership values, what we should be, I think, thinking about that's going to be most helpful to us in working with diverse populations includes values that sadly aren't quite as married to the self-concept of Americans, which is justice, independence, and freedom, the importance of community life, self-determination, and social change. Particularly the last one, I think, is often considered to be a threat to society, and that's reflective of the fact that it's a threat to the majority, those who are in control, and when the status quo is threatened, they're going to work to try to prevent social change. Justice should be available to all, and it should be applied impartially. And if our social conditions are not just, it's really our responsibility as social workers to act on behalf of our clients and our client groups to get those injustices corrected. So I hope there's a few tidbits for thought in this short lecture, this short talk about a framework for practice. Please let me know if any questions come up. Also consider bringing your thoughts to our Collaborate sessions and talking it over together as a group. Thank you.